So, the unreasonable nature of enlightenment. What I wanted to talk about was ego death, the novel's subject. A very confusing thing to talk about. Everybody interested in enlightenment hears about ego death, but I wonder how many people actually know what it means. So I wanted to talk about what I think it means, what I understand that it means, and maybe you'll find that helpful. I hope so. But before we speak about ego death, I wanted to introduce a different way, as a way of thinking about spiritual transformation, human transformation, positive vertical transformation from a relative perspective or an absolute perspective. So transformation from a relative perspective means I'm improving. I stop smoking. I stop drinking. I get angry less. I am kinder and gentler and more generous. I'm becoming a better person through learning to forgive myself and control myself. And everybody tells me I'm improving. And as a result, life is getting better. So that we could call that, generally speaking, relative transformation. Absolute transformation is a huge non-linear leap of change that is always dramatic and much bigger than we ever imagined that it could be. So enlightenment, as I understand it, is not about relative change, even though relative change is a good thing, is a positive thing, and something I think we all want to be busy with for our whole lives, getting better all the time and improving all the time, especially if we're interested in an evolutionary approach to life. If we're evolutionaries, we would like to at least think that we're constantly improving ourselves and developing ourselves and getting better. Whether that's actually true or not is another question. But it would be something that we would aspire to if we are evolutionarily oriented. But an absolute transformation is a non-linear leap into a completely different realm of being and knowing and existing. And for the non-linear leap to occur, which is called enlightenment usually, the ego's got to die. Sorry, that doesn't work any other way. And I wanted to try and explain what I think I understand what I think I mean by that. So everybody can actually get a sense of what it actually means, because to repeat, the concept of the idea of ego death is thrown around maybe too casually by too many teachers, and I think it's confusing. So I would say that except in the rarest of cases of unusual realizers, what we're calling the ego or the frontal self doesn't die a permanent death. So if you meet anybody who think their ego doesn't exist, you're probably wrong. Their ego is probably still alive and full, ready to make all the problems that the ego does for us still. But I think another way to understand what ego death is all about is to see it as a moment or a long moment, a period of time when what we're calling the ego, the frontal self, the personality, the self structure that contains our personal story, comes to a halt and just stops completely. It's a very particular kind of mind moment of transcendence. And once again, this moment of transcendence happens when the mind and the frontal self, the personality with its story, its relationship to its conditioned relationship to past, present, and future. Usually it's painful relationship to past, present, and future. and painful and conditioned relationship to past, present, and future comes to a screeching halt. And it could come to screeching halt for 1 second, or 5 minutes, or 10 minutes, or a few hours, or a few days. But the leap, the non-relative, non-linear leap that gives rise to enlightened awareness and to radical transformation happens when the, excuse me, when the mind comes to a complete halt. And temporarily, the story, our personal story, my ego story, my frontal personality story, and its conditioned and painful relationship to past, present, and future ceases to exist, even for a few moments. So ego death, it would be when is when the ego usually temporarily subsides from the picture. And even a brief mind moment of the ego disappearing from existence, dying, disappearing, can yield extraordinary and can have extraordinary long-term effects on our souls and on our psyches and on our being. You know, I think that what catalyzes the awakening to enlightened awareness is ego death. In some way, shape, or form or another, it has to happen. And upon thinking about, excuse me, and upon thinking about it, giving it some consideration, I realized that the ego dies in only 2 ways, one of 2 ways. The first is the best. And the first is through these experience of unreasonable happiness and unreasonable joy, unimaginable contentment. It's possible to become spiritually completely overwhelmed with joy and lightness of being, overwhelmed by an intensity of joy, an intensity of lightness of being, intensity of bliss and happiness that's so profound, so powerful that it literally stops the mind in its tracks. And under the weight and intensity of this kind of joy and bliss and happiness, the mind disappears. And this ego structure disappears under the weight of this bliss and joy. It just gives up. It literally gives up. It comes to its knees. It just says, I can't survive the intensity of this happiness. And when one experiences that much happiness and that much joy with so much intensity, one really has no choice at a certain point but to give up, which is the whole idea. So ego death is when the ego, which is the structure of the frontal self, frontal personality with its story, is brought to a complete halt. It completely arrests itself and falls down to its knees and says, I give up. And whether this profound transformative experience of giving up or being compelled to give up by the intensity of the unreasonable happiness lasts for a few seconds or lasts for a few minutes or a few hours or even longer, it doesn't really matter. But the point I want to make is that ego death is usually a temporary event. But if it's for real, if it's the real thing, even a few seconds can change your life forever. Because a lot of people want to know, does enlightenment exist? What is it and how do I attain it? So I want to assure everybody it's real, it does exist. What the Buddha spoke about was real. What Ramana Maharshi was describing to us is all real. And it's attainable for all of us. The only way to reach that state of consciousness is by getting to that point in our own spiritual development where we're compelled to give up, to stop resisting, to give in. Giving in means declaring wholeheartedly and helplessly. Not my will, but thy will be done. I can't do this on my own. I can't do this anymore. I'm in your hands. I'm yours. Take me. And so I think that it's good to have a clear sense of what that actually means, so we can know what we're aiming for here. So in the first case scenario, we're brought to our knees by the experience of unreasonable joy and unreasonable happiness, unreasonable bliss, and ecstasy. And to repeat, it's an ecstasy that's so profound that we cannot resist it. It overwhelms our self-nature, our self-structure to such a degree that we just feel compelled to give up. There's nothing else we can do. We have to surrender unconditionally, radically, totally and completely, because we have no choice. The joy was so intense, we just had to stop. And when we stop, the mind stops completely. And it's these moments when the mind has completely come to a halt. It's something profound that happens to us at a soul level. That's called lasting transformation. That's when we come back from the abyss and we're not the same person anymore. We've seen something so profound, so extraordinary, so miraculous, so glorious, that we can never be the same again. It's choiceless, and it's choiceless. So when we experience a non-relative but absolute shift, it doesn't matter how long it lasts, but if we achieve a non-relative or absolute shift, we return from the abyss a changed person, change in a profound way. Now, of course, it all depends upon how intense the experience was. Usually, the greater the intensity of the experience of being crushed, the more profound is the transformation that results from it. So just try to keep in mind here that being a good spiritual practitioner, meditating every day, and doing all the right things that we think we should do if we want to develop, aren't necessarily in and of themselves going to be enough. Because the only thing that's enough is what's going to bring us into a moment of unconditional submission, and the only other kind of experience that will catalyze this kind of dramatic impact on our being is suffering. And sometimes suffering can become so intense, so acute, so overwhelming, that it can also bring us to our knees and compel us to give up and to stop resisting, and to say, not my will, but thy will be done. And sometimes that's how we achieve that result. That's sometimes how transformation happens. It's through unreasonable pain and unreasonable suffering, just as it can happen through unreasonable joy and unreasonable happiness. But ego death is a result of giving up. Absolute giving up. It's when we have no choice but to give up. It's not the result of a decision. It's not something we make up our mind, I'm going to give up. It's something that we find ourselves compelled to do by the deepest dimensions of our own self, choicelessly. So ego death is a tangible thing. And the beautiful thing about ego death is that if we experience it, it's a moment beyond time when our strategies become irrelevant. And we realize there's nothing more we can do except to let go. There's literally nothing else that's going to save us. The mind is destroyed in that. The ego is destroyed, where we find ourselves utterly helpless and utterly vulnerable and hopefully utterly willing. So once again, ego death is real, but it's not, at least in the way that I understand it, which is just based on my own experience. All I can speak about is what I know from my own experience. The ego, it's not that the ego dies once and for all and forever and never to return again. I don't think such things like that hardly ever happen. Maybe once in a very long while, but rarely. But it's more that the ego and the mind stop completely for a few seconds, a few minutes, a few hours, or longer. It doesn't have to be that long. It just has to be enough to become completely crushed and utterly annihilated at the level of the ego, the level of the mind. And if it's complete and utter, even for a few seconds, it will leave us utterly changed and transformed. Not perfectly, but dramatically. And it's these kinds of moments, these kinds of mind moments, that change everything. It's good to try and be clear about this. Because we think, well, maybe if I meditate a little longer every day, it will help me get a little closer. It may help, but it might not help. Because all the strategies in the world in the end have to be given up anyway. This is kind of the point I wanted to make. And what spirit or God or consciousness seems to be asking for from all of us, from a relative point of view, is unreasonable. Because God or spirit or consciousness seems to be demanding everything from us if we want to be free, if we want to awaken to enlightened awareness. She's asking for nothing but everything we have to give. And we usually don't want to give that much for anything or anyone, even for God. That's the challenge. That's why usually these mind moments where we come to a halt, everything stops completely, usually catch us by surprise. It's usually something we don't expect is going to happen. But sometimes the experience of, if we're lucky, joy, unreasonable happiness, lightness of being, ecstasy can become so overwhelming that we just stop and give up and let go. And in the same way, sometimes our experience of suffering can become so overwhelming that we can utterly find ourselves helpless and on our knees, begging for release. And that's what it takes. So what I'm describing is not the kind of thing most people really want to experience, because it's too daunting, it's too overwhelming, it's too frightening, really. This is why I always encourage people to spend a lot of time in their spiritual practice cultivating the conscious desire, the conscious intention to want to be free, to really think about it, to confront yourself. Do I want to be unconditionally free? Should I experience it? Would I be able to handle that kind of freedom? And am I really ready for it? Is it what I really want? Because if I want to be that free, I'm going to have to be willing to give up being in control at a very primary and fundamental level of my being. Once and for all and forever, eternally for eternity, giving up and letting go at the deepest level of our being. And that's something we have to be prepared for. So as we can't necessarily catalyze the kind of intensive mind moment that I was just describing as a result of will, we can certainly prepare ourselves to be ready for it. And the way to prepare ourselves to be ready for it is to engage in a contemplation that requires a contemplation that requires us to confront the actuality of our desire for freedom, our desire for enlightenment. Do I really want it, and am I prepared for it? Because it's an assault on the way things are like nothing else ever could be. Most people find that within their first glimpses of enlightenment, most people find that it's too much, and that they're not really ready for it yet. So I think the best thing we can do, most constructive thing we can do in terms of spiritual practice, is to prepare ourselves to get as ready as we possibly can here and now for the leap. Because we only can be as ready as we can be. We can only be as ready as we can be. And we're only going to know how ready we are when the moment actually comes. Are we going to resist, or are we going to continue to hold on? Will we freeze up in fear, or will we submit and let go? That's the question. So it's contemplating the absolute and non-relative nature of the ordeal that will prepare us to let go. When you awaken to enlightened awareness, you don't get anything. You lose everything. So it's only letting go. It's not a receiving of any particular gift. One is stripped naked. And for this, we need to be ready. And we can prepare ourselves. But it requires a deadly seriousness about all this. Because enlightenment, as I understand it, is not about self-improvement. There's nothing to do with working out our neurosis, or coming to terms with our pain and fear. It's about letting go of our whole story, dramatically and in an instant, if we can. It's at least being ready to do that. As all of you have heard so many times, it's a leap from the known to the unknown. But it's a genuine leap. It's not just fancy words. The beautiful part of it is life can change so much if we're willing to take this leap, and if we're prepared for it when it happens. Our life can change in the most dramatic ways beyond what we can imagine. That's really true. Our dreams can come true if we're willing to let go of everything else that's in the way. Easier said than done. After spending 3 weeks with my own teacher, the great H.W. Punja, I spent 3 weeks with him, day and night. And he told me when I was about to leave, he said, "Andrew, when you leave me, something very big is going to happen to you." And I didn't believe him, because I was wondering how he could possibly know what was going to happen to me. Nobody can predict the future, so I thought. And I didn't believe him. But shortly after I left him, something very big started happening. And it was very dramatic and very overwhelming. It was something I could not have prepared myself for beforehand, because there's no way you can prepare yourself for it, even though I just said there is. And I realized in those few moments, or those few hours, those few days, that everything that I had ever dreamed of was actually happening. But it was much bigger than I could have ever imagined that it actually could be. I felt I was being consumed by a mysterious presence that I couldn't see, but I could feel. And I was both exhilarated and thrilled, and I'm profoundly excited and deeply terrified. Because I realized this was bigger than I could control. It was bigger than me. That I was out of control. And I literally felt like I was being possessed or taken over by this mysterious presence that I couldn't see. And I also felt that if this process didn't stop, that there would be nothing left of me in the end, and I didn't know what that meant. But it was, as it was exhilarating, it was also completely terrifying. Because the letting go was happening at levels that were beyond my conscious control, which is kind of how it happens when it really happens. And once we go through an ordeal like that, all we have to do from then on is not to doubt it, and to accept it, and to continue to surrender. If you really let go when this kind of thing happens to you, there's no way back. Which is the whole idea, actually, if you're serious. So when we think about transformation, we can think about it as in the context of relative change and relative improvement. Self-improvement, self-development, which is all very positive and wholesome and good. All good stuff to be involved with for all of us. The relative self-improvement is not the kind of radical shift or radical transformation I'm speaking about. Radical transformation, the radical transformation that leads to the awakening to enlightened awareness, requires the ego to die. Not forever, but for a few seconds at least. The mind has to completely stop, and the ego has to completely disappear. For you, and for all of us to find out who we really are, what's actually really going on here. Relative transformation doesn't lead to absolute transformation. Relative transformation leads to relative transformation, and absolute transformation is what it is, not the same thing. What are you aiming for? What are you aiming for? What are you hoping for in your own journey? Because what you're aiming for and what you're hoping for is probably going to have a lot to do with how far you actually end up going. So it's good to think in terms of your own self-contemplation and inquiry about your own interest in enlightenment. Are you ready to let go? Are you prepared to take the leap beyond the mind from which there's no return? Or do you merely want your life to be a better life, a happier life, a more peaceful life where there's less suffering? Or do you want emancipation? Do you want to realize the dimension of reality that's unconditioned and unconditional? The freedom, unimaginable freedom, is the very ground of reality itself, always. These are things to think about. And if you begin to think, if you think this way, and being very serious with yourself, you can prepare yourself. to be ready to let go. I feel quite convinced, this is my belief, that if we're deadly serious about this and utterly committed, that it will happen sooner or later. It has to, if we are focused on this alone and are not distracted by other things or tempted by other things, but are deeply one-pointed and intent to reach the yonder shore in this life, we will. But very few people are that sincere, that serious about this, serious about other things. When you're very serious about this, there are other forces at work that seem to come to support us. When the evolution of consciousness and the liberation of consciousness becomes our primary motivation in a way that is very real and very serious, there are forces and inherent momentums in consciousness itself that seem to reveal themselves and make themselves apparent. Forces and momentums that we were not previously aware of. It seems that the universe, or the deepest interior of the whole universe, which is subjectivity and consciousness, is not static, but seems to, in my experience, it seems to want to become more conscious. Consciousness seems to want to become more conscious, if that makes any sense to you. Consciousness delights in its own self-recognition, and there are forces at work inherent in consciousness itself, where there is seems to be a mysterious aspiration towards greater depth, towards greater reality and greater gnosis. And when you awaken to these internal momentums inherent in the deeper layers of consciousness itself, you'll start to feel yourself entering into a different world. Because we're not alone in all this. If you really want this kind of liberation, this kind of freedom, the universe will help you. It helped me. It's still helping me. The rational, excuse me, the rational, sorry. The rational mind finds these things very hard to believe, understandably, because we're not speaking about rational territory, we're speaking about trans-rational reality. So you could say part of everything I'm describing requires a leap of faith, which is true. It means you have to realize that there's a truth about the nature of reality that transcends the mind's ability to cognize it. And this truth is more significant, more relevant, and more important than anything that the mind could ever come up with. You've got to know that deeply in your soul. Because in the end, of course, we want to gain confidence, spiritual self-confidence that will get us through this. And spiritual self-confidence comes from the kinds of experiences that I've been speaking about. They convince us about this non-relative absolute dimension of reality. So we become doubtless and fearless about it. I don't know what more to say really about it. Just that it's real. And in order for this to work, you not only do you have to take it seriously, you have to be willing to take yourself seriously, the best part of your own self, deadly seriously. You have to believe in yourself and believe that you can do this. Because nobody can believe in you for you. Nobody can believe in you for you. You have to do that for yourself. We all do. So from one hand, there's all the help in the world available to us, which is what I was just speaking about. And then on the other hand, we're completely alone in this. Taking this kind of leap is something we're either prepared for or not, in the privacy of our own soul, really. So ego death is real. Ego death is a mind moment. It's a moment when the mind completely comes to a halt. It's when the ego disappears. The mind of the personality disappears completely for a few seconds, for a few moments, or longer. Doesn't matter how long it happens for, as long as the mind is completely arrested. And you're willing to go through it. What we would hope for is that we're so seduced by the joy that's inherent in the nature of consciousness itself, the unreasonable happiness that's available to all of us in our own consciousness, that we become utterly destroyed by joy. What could be better than that? In some experiences I've had when I was younger, the experience of joy was so intense that I thought I was going to die. It was so powerful, it was so overwhelming. Joy and ecstasy can become painful at a certain point because it's so intense. But it can free us from the ego. And in the same way, as unfortunately too many of us are well aware, more often than not, and too often, it seems to be the case that the only thing that will get us to let go is unbearable suffering. Unfortunately. Sometimes there's no other way to find a way to humility than enduring unimaginable pain. But it's part of the process, it's part of the path. And we have to be willing to embrace all of it if we want to be free. The main thing I wanted to convey to all of you simply is that ego death is real and it's got to happen. And I wanted to try and describe it in a way that to make it tangible and graspable as a truth, not some strange metaphysical idea, but it's something we can all relate to.